I've been a park ranger at Whispering Pines National Forest for over a decade, and in all that time, the forest has never felt like just a job to me. It's a vast, untamed expanse, stretching hundreds of miles with towering pines that seem to touch the sky and valleys where rivers carve their way through the earth like veins. It's the kind of place that can make you feel small in the best way, reminding you of nature's vastness and your fleeting place in it. I've dealt with everything from lost hikers to territorial bears, but no matter the situation, the forest was always a sanctuary, a place where logic and experience were enough to handle anything. That belief held strong until the day I answered a call about a missing family, a call that led me to the most harrowing experience of my life. It was a late autumn morning when dispatch radioed in the report. A family of 4 had failed to check out of their campsite, located deep in a remote section of the park. The reservation log showed they'd arrived 2 days earlier, but there'd been no sign of them since. It wasn't uncommon for campers to extend their stays without notifying anyone, and most missing persons cases resolved themselves within hours. But something about this call felt different. The dispatcher mentioned the family's last communication, a frantic phone call from the father, reporting that something was stalking their campsite. The call had cut out before he could give details, leaving only a faint trace of static and his wife's distant scream in the background. I packed my gear and headed out immediately, brushing off the unease creeping up my spine. The air was crisp as I drove the parked jeep along the narrow dirt road leading to the campsite. The forest had a peculiar stillness that morning, the kind that made the usual sounds of rustling leaves and chirping birds seem deafening by their absence. When I arrived at the site, the first thing I noticed was the eerie quiet. No animals stirred in the underbrush, and even the wind seemed reluctant to pass through. The campsite itself was a mess. The tent stood half collapsed, its fabric torn in places as if by something clawing at it. The remnants of a fire sat cold and untouched, surrounded by scattered belongings, a shoe here, a backpack there. A child's stuffed animal lay face down in the dirt, its fur damp with dew. But the strangest thing was the lack of footprints. The ground was soft, ideal for tracking, but the family's trail stopped abruptly a few feet away from the tent, as if they'd been lifted into the air and carried off. I radioed dispatch to report the findings and started a grid search of the area, hoping to pick up a trail. That's when I noticed the claw marks. They were gouged deep into the bark of a nearby tree, running vertically in parallel lines that suggested something enormous. I've seen bear markings before, but these were different, too clean, too deliberate. My stomach twisted as I examined them, the hairs on my arms standing on end. The claw marks weren't the only thing. A faint, sickly sweet smell lingered in the air, like rotting fruit mixed with the metallic tang of blood. I tried to shake the growing unease, telling myself it was just an overactive imagination fueled by the strange circumstances. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. As I continued searching the area, the forest seemed to close in around me. The towering pines, once a comforting presence, now felt oppressive, their branches interlocking overhead to create a suffocating canopy. The usual sounds of the wilderness were absent, replaced by a heavy, unsettling silence. I checked my map and compass, both of which seemed to function fine, but the woods felt disorienting in a way I couldn't explain. Trails that should have been familiar twisted in unfamiliar directions, and landmarks appeared where they shouldn't have been. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure standing among the trees. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or a shadow cast by the swaying branches. But the figure didn't move with the trees. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long for its body and a head that tilted slightly as if observing me. My heart raced as I tried to focus on it, but the more I stared, the harder it became to make out its features. Its outline shimmered like heat waves rising from asphalt, and its face was a blur, as though the forest itself refused to let me see it clearly. I froze, my hand instinctively going to the knife on my belt. For what felt like an eternity, the figure stood motionless, its presence radiating a palpable sense of malice. Then, without warning, it turned and vanished into the shadows, moving with an unnatural fluidity that sent a chill down my spine. My rational mind tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Maybe it was just a large animal, distorted by my fear and the dim light filtering through the trees. But a deeper, more primal part of me knew better. I pressed on, trying to focus on the task at hand, but the sense of being watched grew stronger. Every time I stopped to rest or check my bearings, I felt eyes on me, cold, calculating, and unrelenting. The claw marks became more frequent, crisscrossing the trees like territorial warnings, and then there were the whispers. At first I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. It was faint, like distant voices carried on the breeze, but no matter where I turned, I couldn't pinpoint the source. By the time I reached the ranger station at sunset, I was a mess. My report to dispatch was disjointed, filled with vague descriptions and half-formed thoughts. I didn't mention the figure or the whispers. I knew how it would sound, and I wasn't ready to be dismissed as a lunatic. That night I tried to sleep, but the dreams came. They were vivid and suffocating, filled with flashes of the figure standing over me, its faceless head tilting as if studying my fear. When I woke, claw marks adorned the windowsill, fresh and deep. The next morning I couldn't shake the sense that I was being followed. Every shadow seemed to stretch too far. Every rustle in the underbrush sent my pulse racing. I told myself it was paranoia, a natural response to the stress of the job. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I wasn't alone in these woods. The forest felt alive, as though it had become a single sentient entity conspiring to unnerve me. I organized a search party with 2 other rangers, armed with radios and rifles, though the weapons felt useless against whatever was out there. As we combed the area near the campsite, the clues grew more sinister. We found pieces of clothing snagged on branches, a baby's shoe half buried in the dirt, and long trails of claw marks etched into the ground. The whispers returned, louder now, forming fragmented words that seemed to echo inside my head. Leave. Die. Watcher. One of the rangers, a younger recruit named Jason, spotted something in the distance, a fleeting shadow darting between the trees. He called out, but there was no response, only the distant snapping of branches. I don't like this, he muttered, his hands gripping his rifle tightly. Something's out there. His voice was steady, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We pressed on, the whispers growing louder and more insistent. Then, as we approached a clearing, Jason screamed. I turned just in time to see him being dragged into the shadows by something too fast for me to track. His screams cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of our ragged breathing and the whispers that seemed to mock our terror. The remaining ranger wanted to leave, but I couldn't. Something compelled me to keep going, a sense of duty or perhaps a desperate need to understand. I pushed deeper into the forest, alone now, following a trail of claw marks that led to a small cave at the base of a hill. The air grew colder as I approached, carrying the same sickly sweet smell I'd encountered at the campsite. The cave loomed ahead, its mouth dark and jagged, like the gaping maw of some slumbering beast. I hesitated at the entrance, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to leave this cursed place and never return. But something about the claw marks and the whispers felt like an invitation, or a challenge. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my fingers trembling as I stepped inside. The air grew colder immediately, thick with the stench of decay and damp earth. My boots crunched over what I assumed were loose rocks, but when I shone the light down, I saw bones, small, brittle ones mixed with larger fragments. The walls of the cave were marked with the same clawed patterns I'd seen throughout the forest, but now they were accompanied by crude symbols scratched into the stone, spirals, jagged lines, and shapes that resembled towering figures with elongated limbs. My pulse quickened as I traced one of the carvings with my flashlight beam, the jagged edges glinting faintly. It didn't feel like art, it felt like a warning. The whispers followed me into the cave, louder now, echoing off the walls in an unholy chorus. Words emerged from the cacophony, fragmented and disjointed but unmistakable. Leave. Watched. End. The sound grew unbearable, reverberating inside my skull until I had to clap my hands over my ears to block it out. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. That's when I saw it. The Watcher emerged from the shadows, its massive frame unfolding with an unnatural fluidity that defied logic. It was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, and impossibly thin, its elongated limbs ending in razor-sharp claws that gleamed in the dim light. Its head tilted as it regarded me, and my flashlight flickered, the beam struggling to illuminate its face. But there was no face, only a void, a shifting, amorphous darkness that seemed to pull at the edges of reality. The Watcher didn't move at first, and neither did I. My mind screamed at me to run, to do anything but stand there, but my body refused to obey. Its presence was suffocating, a weight pressing down on me from all sides. When it finally moved, it did so with a speed that made my stomach lurch. One moment it was standing at the far end of the cave, and the next it was inches from me, its claws inches from my chest. I stumbled backward, raising my flashlight in a feeble attempt to defend myself. The light flared, brighter than it should have, and the watcher recoiled, letting out a guttural screech that rattled my bones. Taking advantage of its retreat, I bolted toward the cave entrance, my heart pounding as the whispers returned, now filled with rage. The forest outside offered little comfort. The trees seemed to shift as I ran, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air grew colder and the whispers followed me, their tone accusatory and venomous. You. See? Us. The words clawed at my mind, each one driving a spike of fear deeper into my soul. I didn't stop running until I reached the ranger station, collapsing against the door as my lungs burned and my legs gave out. Inside, the familiar surroundings offered a brief sense of safety, but it was short-lived. The claw marks on the windowsill had deepened, their edges raw and fresh, and when I glanced at the mirror above the sink, I saw a shadow that didn't belong to me, a shape with elongated limbs and hollow eyes watching from behind. The days that followed were a blur of fear and paranoia. I filed my report with dispatch, carefully omitting any mention of the Watcher or the supernatural events I'd experienced. They chalked up the disappearance of the search party member and the family to a predator likely a bear or mountain lion. But I knew the truth. The forest wasn't just alive, it was angry. Every night I woke to the sound of whispers outside my window, accompanied by the faint scratching of claws on glass. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was the wind or the creak of old wood, but the evidence was undeniable. My dreams were filled with images of the Watcher, its void-like face looming over me, its claws reaching for my throat. The whispers followed me even in my waking hours, faint and distant but persistent. One morning I woke to find claw marks on my truck, deep gouges that ran the length of the driver's side door. The air inside the cabin reeked of decay, and the radio played faint static even though it wasn't turned on. I packed a bag and left Whispering Pines that same day, driving for hours until the forest was nothing more than a distant memory in my rearview mirror. But the terror didn't end there. Even in the city, far from the isolation of the woods, I felt the Watcher's presence. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, and reflections in windows carried shapes that weren't there when I turned around. The whispers grew fainter, but they never stopped. They became a constant hum in the back of my mind, a reminder that I hadn't truly escaped. I tried to warn others about Whispering Pines, posting my account online and sharing my story with anyone who would listen. Most dismissed me as a crackpot, a washed-up ranger driven mad by isolation. But a few, those who'd had their own brushes with the unknown, believed me. They told me of similar creatures, entities that existed beyond human understanding, feeding on fear and despair. The final straw came a month later when I woke to find a message scrawled on my bedroom wall. The words were written in a dark, viscous substance that smelled of decay. You saw us. Now we see you. I don't sleep much anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I see the Watcher, its hollow face staring back at me. I've moved 3 times in the past year, but it doesn't seem to matter. The shadows follow me wherever I go, the whispers growing louder with each passing day. I'm writing this as a warning to anyone who dares to venture into Whispering Pines. Stay on the marked trails. Don't wander off, no matter what you hear or see. And if you ever feel like you're being watched, leave immediately. The forest doesn't forget, and neither does the Watcher.